Sometimes the things we bury stay buried until we're finally ready to face them. Neil Briar learned that at 58, standing alone on a mountain ridge, with dirt under his fingernails and tears he didn't expect. 45 years ago, he and his uncle buried a strange black rock up here, just a boy's summer ritual that faded into memory. But after his divorce, while clearing out his uncle's old cabin, Neil remembered. He hiked back and dug it up. The rock had cracked over the decades. When he split it open, crystals sparkled inside, beautiful, ancient, impossible. But it wasn't the crystals that broke him. It was the memory that came with them, and the message his uncle had been trying to leave him all along. What had been hidden inside that rock for 45 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and something else, memory perhaps, or simply the weight of years settling into the spaces between trees. Neil Briar stood on the porch of his late uncle's cabin, keys heavy in his palm, and wondered how a place could feel both foreign and familiar at the same time. 6 months had passed since Uncle Raymond's funeral. 6 months of paperwork, estate lawyers, and the slow realization that he was now the keeper of a mountain sanctuary he'd barely visited in 20 years. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks ago. Linda had taken the house in town, and here he was, 58 years old, and starting over in a place that smelled like his childhood. The cabin door opened with a reluctant groan, hinges protesting decades of mountain weather. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned since Raymond stopped being able to reach them. Everything was exactly as his uncle had left it. Surveying maps spread across the kitchen table, coffee mug still sitting by the sink with a brown ring at the bottom, reading glasses folded on top of a geology magazine dated February 2024. Neil set his duffel bag down and walked slowly through the main room. The walls were covered with photographs, mostly landscapes, a few family pictures, and several shots of Neil as a boy that he didn't remember being taken. In one, he couldn't have been more than 12, standing next to Raymond by a creek, both of them grinning at something off camera. The sight of it hit him unexpectedly, a sharp pang of loss mixed with something warmer. His phone buzzed. A text from Martin, his old ranger colleague. "How's the cabin clean-out going? Need anything?" Neil typed back, "Just getting started." Place is like a time capsule. Raymond never threw anything away. Take your time with it. That was Martin, practical, steady, the kind of friend who checked in without making it feel like pity. They'd worked together for 15 years in the backcountry before Neil semi-retired, and Martin understood the particular silence that came with mountains and loss. Neil pocketed the phone and continued his exploration. Uncle Raymond's bedroom was sparse, but orderly bed made with military precision, clothes hung in the closet by type and color. The bathroom held the basics: soap, toothbrush, medications for a heart that had finally given out in his sleep. It struck Neil that this was how a man lived when he'd made peace with solitude. The kitchen table drew him back. Among the surveying maps and geological surveys, Neil found a brass compass with the initials RB engraved on the back. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the way the needle swung to find magnetic north with unwavering certainty. Raymond had carried this compass for decades, using it to map wilderness areas that most people would never see. A photograph tucked under the compass caught his eye. Raymond and a woman Neil didn't recognize, both young, standing beside Mirror Lake. The woman was painting at an easel while Raymond watched, his expression soft in a way Neil had never seen. On the back, in Raymond's careful handwriting, "Claire, summer 1979, Claire." Neil turned the name over in his mind, but couldn't place it. Raymond had never mentioned a Claire, had never talked much about his personal life at all. He'd been the uncle who appeared for holidays and birthdays, who took Neil camping in the summers when Neil's own father was too busy or too distant to bother. Raymond had been steady, patient, present in all the ways Neil's father wasn't. The kitchen was well stocked, despite Raymond's months-long absence. Canned goods lined the shelves with the precision of a man who understood winter isolation. Neil opened a can of soup for dinner, eating it while studying the maps spread across the table. Red marks indicated survey points, blue showed water sources, and green marked what looked like hiking trails. But there were other marks too, purple dots at seemingly random locations, with dates going back decades. After dinner, Neil sorted through Raymond's papers, bank statements, utility bills, correspondence with the Forest Service, the mundane documents of a life lived quietly but with purpose. At the bottom of one stack, he found a letter addressed to him, dated just 2 months before Raymond died. "Neil," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're probably wondering what to do with all my stuff. Keep what speaks to you. Donate the rest. But there's something else. Something I should have shared with you years ago but didn't know how. Look for the brass compass. There's more to it than meets the eye. Some things take time to reveal themselves, just like some people. Take care of yourself, boy. You're stronger than you think. Uncle Raymond." Neil looked at the compass again, turning it over in his hands. It seemed ordinary enough, well made, well used, but nothing obviously hidden or special. He set it aside and continued sorting, but Raymond's words echoed in his mind. There's more to it than meets the eye. As evening deepened into night, Neil made up Raymond's bed with sheets he found in the linen closet. They smelled like cedar and lavender, like the mountains themselves. He lay awake listening to the cabin settle around him, to the wind moving through the pines, to the profound quiet that only came this far from civilization. His thoughts drifted to Iris, his 32-year-old daughter. They hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since the fight about the divorce. She'd accused him of giving up, of running away, instead of working on his marriage. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd inherited more than Raymond's compass. Maybe he'd inherited his pattern of quiet withdrawal too. Linda had tried, God knows she'd tried. 28 years of marriage, and she'd spent the last 10 of them trying to reach a man who'd apparently learned from his father how to be present in body, but absent in spirit. The divorce had been her idea, but Neil knew it was his fault. He'd given her loneliness disguised as companionship, silence dressed up as strength. Now, lying in his uncle's bed, Neil wondered if Raymond had been lonely too. The photograph of Claire suggested otherwise, but why had Neil never met her? Why had Raymond spent 40 years alone in this cabin? Outside, something rustled in the underbrush, probably a raccoon or a deer. The sound reminded Neil of camping trips with Raymond, of nights when his uncle would point out constellations and tell stories about the land they were crossing. Raymond had a way of making the wilderness feel both vast and intimate, a place where a person could lose themselves and find themselves at the same time. "Some things take time to reveal themselves," Neil repeated softly to the darkness. Tomorrow he'd start the real work of sorting through a lifetime of accumulated memories. Tonight he'd let the mountain silence hold him, just as it had held Raymond for so many years. Outside his window, the stars wheeled overhead with ancient patience, marking time in a rhythm older than human worry, older than regret. The brass compass sat on the nightstand, its needle pointing steadily north, waiting. Morning broke grey and cool over the mountains, mist clinging to the valleys like something reluctant to let go. Neil woke with a strange certainty, as if his dreams had been working on a puzzle his conscious mind couldn't solve. The brass compass caught the early light from the nightstand, and suddenly he knew what Raymond meant. There's more to it than meets the eye. Neil had spent 3 days sorting through his uncle's belongings, making neat piles for donation, for keeping, for decisions he wasn't ready to make. But this morning felt different. This morning he remembered something that had been buried for 45 years. He was 12, maybe 13, standing on a ridge with Uncle Raymond during one of those magical summer weeks when his parents would send him to the mountains. Raymond had been carrying something in his pack, something wrapped in old canvas that he handled with unusual care. "What's that, Uncle Raymond?" Something special, Neil. Something that needs to wait. They'd hiked to a high ridge overlooking the valley, a place where you could see for miles in every direction. Raymond had found a spot beneath a distinctive rock formation, two boulders leaning against each other like old friends, and started digging with a small spade. "Are we burying treasure?" young Neil had asked, excitement bubbling in his voice. "In a way," Raymond had replied, his expression serious but kind. "This is important, Neil. Someday, when you're ready, you'll come back here. And when you do, you'll understand." The memory came back in pieces, the weight of the wrapped object when Raymond let him hold it, briefly smooth, dense, oddly warm, the ceremony of lowering it into the hole. The careful way Raymond covered it and marked the spot with a small cairn of stones. "How will I remember where it is?" "You'll remember. When the time comes, you'll remember everything." Neil sat up in bed, his heart beating faster, the ridge, the two leaning boulders. He could picture it clearly now, could feel the pull of it like magnetic north. But what had they buried, and why? He dressed quickly, hiking boots, weathered jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. The mountains demanded practical clothing and respect for their moods. He filled a water bottle, grabbed the small spade from Raymond's tool shed, and studied the topographic maps spread across the kitchen table. The ridge wasn't marked on any map, but Neil's body remembered the route. Past the creek, up through the stand of aspens where the leaves would turn gold in another month. Then the steep climb through pine and granite to where the world opened up in all directions. The hike took longer than he expected. His 58-year-old legs protested the incline. His breathing came harder than it had 20 years ago when he was still ranging the backcountry daily. But the trail was familiar beneath his boots, muscle memory, guiding him through turns and over obstacles that hadn't changed in decades. Halfway up, he stopped to rest and drink water. The valley spread below him, vast and quiet, touched with morning mist. This was what Raymond had loved, the sense of being both small and infinite, connected to something larger than human concerns. Neil pulled out his phone to check the time and noticed he had no signal. Good. Whatever was waiting for him on that ridge deserved his full attention. The final climb was the steepest, loose scree and granite ledges that required hands as much as feet. But then he crested the rise and saw them, the two leaning boulders, exactly as he remembered. Time had weathered them, lichens had spread across their surfaces, but they stood unchanged, patient sentinels marking the spot where a boy and his uncle had shared a secret. Neil approached slowly, studying the ground. 4.5 decades of weather had scattered the original cairn, but there a slight depression in the earth, a place where the wild grass grew differently. He knelt and began to dig. The first few inches yielded nothing but dirt and roots. Neil's hands remembered this work from his surveying days, the careful excavation, the attention to what lay beneath the surface. The spade struck something solid after 10 minutes of digging. Not metal, not wood, stone. Neil brushed away the dirt with his fingers, revealing a surface that was smooth and black as obsidian. He dug around the edges, defining the shape roughly oval, about the size of a cantaloupe. It took effort to work it free from the packed earth, and when he finally lifted it, the weight surprised him. Heavier than he remembered from childhood, dense with whatever mystery Raymond had trusted him to eventually uncover. The rock was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly black, polished by time and weather into something that felt more crafted than natural. But there was something else, a crack, hairline thin, running around its middle like an equator. The crack hadn't been there 45 years ago. Neil was certain of that. He sat back on his heels, holding the stone in both hands. The morning sun was warming the ridge now, burning off the mist, revealing the full scope of the valley below. This was where it had begun, whatever Raymond had set in motion all those years ago. But what was he supposed to do with it now? The crack seemed to pulse in the sunlight, a flaw that might be a doorway. Neil traced it with his finger, feeling the slight separation where time and pressure had done their work. The stone was ready to open. had been ready perhaps for years, waiting for him to climb this ridge, to remember, to be ready for whatever lay inside. But not here. This felt like a moment that deserved privacy, contemplation, the kind of careful attention Raymond had always brought to important things. Neil wrapped the stone carefully in his flannel shirt and made his way back down the mountain, moving slowly, protecting his cargo from the jolting of the descent. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was high, and the stone felt warm against his chest where he'd cradled it during the hike. He set it carefully on the kitchen table next to the brass compass, these two artifacts of Raymond's legacy, waiting for him to understand their connection. Neil made coffee and sat looking at the cracked stone. Whatever was inside had been waiting 45 years to be revealed. Another hour wouldn't hurt. But his hands were already reaching for the hammer and chisel he'd seen in Raymond's toolkit. Some moments, once they arrived, couldn't be postponed. The first gentle tap did nothing. The second created a small shower of black dust. The third, the stone split cleanly along its natural fault line, opening like a book. Neil's breath caught in his throat. Inside, nestled in a cavity that seemed impossibly delicate, was a cluster of crystals that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in purple, blue, and silver. Amethyst geode. He recognized it from Raymond's geology magazines. But there was something else, something that made his hands tremble as he reached for it. A small, weatherproof pouch tucked beside the crystals, and inside that, folded with care, a note written in Raymond's familiar hand. "Neil," it began. "If you're reading this, you've become the man you needed to become." His uncle's voice, reaching across 4.5 decades with a message that would change everything. Neil's hands trembled as he unfolded the weatherproof note. Raymond's handwriting was as precise as he remembered the careful script of a man who understood that words mattered, that some messages needed to survive decades of waiting. The note was dated the 15th of July, 1980. Neil would have been 13 that summer, still young enough to trust his uncle's mysterious rituals without question, old enough to remember them forever. "Neil," he read aloud to the empty cabin, his voice catching slightly. "If you're reading this, you've become the man you needed to become. I know that because you found your way back here, and you had the courage to open what we buried together." Neil paused, looking at the amethyst crystals catching afternoon light through the cabin window. They were beautiful beyond anything he'd expected, delicate formations that looked like frozen flowers, like captured starlight. But Raymond's words drew him back to the page. "I'm writing this the night before we bury the stone. You're asleep in the next room, tired from our hike, trusting that your old uncle knows what he's doing. Truth is, I'm not entirely sure. But I know this much: some lessons can't be taught. They can only be discovered when a person is ready to understand them." Neil set the note down and walked to the window. The valley spread below him, vast and patient, the same view Raymond had contemplated for decades. What had his uncle seen out there that Neil was only now beginning to glimpse? He returned to reading. "You asked me once why rocks are different colors, why some are hard and others soft. I told you about pressure and time, about how the earth changes everything it touches if we're patient enough to let it work. You're like those rocks, Neil. Right now you're just beginning to form, but someday you'll understand what you're meant to become." A memory surfaced, sitting by a campfire with Raymond, throwing questions at him like sparks into the darkness. Why is water wet? Why do stars die? Why don't grown-ups listen the way you do, Uncle Raymond? And Raymond, answering each question seriously, as if Neil's curiosity was the most important thing in the world. This geode took millions of years to form. Started as a hollow space in volcanic rock, then water seeped in, carrying minerals that crystallized layer by layer, year by year, until something beautiful grew in that empty place. Sometimes the most magnificent things come from the deepest hollows, Neil. Remember that when life feels empty, Neil touched the crystals gently, empty space becoming something beautiful. The metaphor wasn't lost on him, not after the divorce. not after months of feeling like a hollow man going through the motions of living. But there was more to the note. I've hidden 3 more stones for you to find. 3 more lessons that I couldn't teach you as a boy, but that you'll understand as a man. The riddles below will lead you to them. But Neil, don't dig alone. Life's discoveries are meant to be shared. Bring someone who matters. 3 riddles followed, written in Raymond's careful hand, where we watched stars tell their ancient stories and learned that dying light still guides us home, where water meets sky and we spoke of roads not taken, where I said goodbye, where you'll understand. Neil read them twice, 3 times. The first one seemed familiar, something about watching stars, the fire tower maybe. He and Raymond had spent nights there during several summers, Raymond teaching him constellations, sharing stories about navigating by starlight. The second riddle was more mysterious. Water meets sky that could be any of a dozen mountain lakes. But roads not taken suggested something specific, something personal. The third made no sense at all. Where had Raymond said goodbye? He'd died in his sleep at the cabin. There'd been no dramatic farewell, no deathbed scenes, just the quiet ending of a quiet man. Neil's phone buzzed, startling him from his thoughts. A text from Martin. "Haven't heard from you in a couple days. Everything okay up there?" Neil stared at the message, then at Raymond's note. "Don't dig alone. Bring someone who matters." Maybe Raymond had known that Neil would need help, that he couldn't solve these riddles in isolation. He called Martin. "Neil, how's the clean-out going?" "It's gotten complicated, Martin. I found something. Something Raymond left for me." A pause. "What kind of something?" Neil looked at the crystals, the note, the brass compass that seemed to tie it all together. "I think I need to show you. Could you come up for the day tomorrow?" "You sound different. You okay?" "I'm not sure. Maybe. Can you come?" "I'll be there by 9. You sure you're not going stir-crazy up there by yourself?" After Martin hung up, Neil sat with the artifacts spread before him like pieces of a puzzle. The geode with its hidden beauty, the note with its cryptic clues, the compass pointing steadily north. Raymond had orchestrated this from beyond the grave, not just the discovery, but the process itself, the careful timing, the riddles that would require thought and effort, the instruction not to dig alone. Why? Neil walked outside as evening approached, the note still in his hand. The mountain air was cooling, carrying scents of pine and earth, and the faint ozone smell that preceded weather. Storm coming, maybe. The mountains were like that, beauty and danger intertwined, demanding respect and attention. He thought about Iris, his daughter, 28 years old, living 3 hours away, nursing hurt feelings from their last conversation. Bring someone who matters. Did Iris still matter to him? Did he still matter to her? The divorce had wounded them both. Iris had taken her mother's side naturally enough, and Neil hadn't fought for her understanding. He'd retreated the way he always retreated when emotions ran high. Linda used to say he had 2 modes, present or absent. No middle ground, no gradual withdrawal. Just there one day, gone the next, even when his body remained in the room. But Raymond's note suggested something different. "You've become the man you needed to become." Had he? Neil didn't feel like much of a man standing alone on this porch, holding a letter from a dead uncle, contemplating riddles like some middle-aged treasure hunter. Still, something had shifted when that stone split open. Some tightness in his chest had loosened, some possibility he hadn't felt in years. Maybe that was what Raymond had been waiting for, not for Neil to become perfect, but for him to become ready. The stars were appearing overhead, faint at first, then brighter as his eyes adjusted to the growing darkness. The same constellations Raymond had shown him decades ago, still wheeling overhead with ancient patience. "Where we watched stars tell their ancient stories," Neil murmured. Tomorrow, Martin would come. Together, they'd start solving Raymond's riddles. But tonight, Neil would sit with this discovery, this gift from the past, and try to understand what his uncle had been trying to teach him all along. The crystals sat on the table inside, catching lamplight like captured stars. Beautiful things, growing in empty spaces, waiting 45 years for someone to crack them open and let their light shine. Maybe some people were like that too. Martin arrived at 9 sharp, his weathered pickup truck kicking up dust as it pulled into the clearing beside Raymond's cabin. At 65, Martin moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent decades navigating dangerous terrain, deliberate, steady, missing nothing. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes still sharp as a hawk's despite the lines around them. "You look like hell," he said by way of greeting, studying Neil's face as he climbed out of the truck. "Good morning to you too," Neil replied, but there was warmth in it. Martin had never been one for pleasantries, which was exactly what Neil needed right now. "Seriously, when's the last time you slept? You've got that wild-eyed look of a man who's been thinking too hard." Neil led him into the cabin, where the artifacts were arranged on the kitchen table like an altar to mystery. The split geode caught morning light streaming through the windows, casting tiny rainbows on the wall. Martin stopped short when he saw it. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly. "Where'd you find this?" Neil told him everything, the recovered memory, the hike to the ridge, the cracked stones splitting open to reveal crystals and a message from the past. Martin listened without interruption, picking up Raymond's note and reading it carefully. "3 more stones," Martin said finally, "and riddles to find them. Your uncle always did like his puzzles. You think I'm crazy for wanting to find them?" Martin studied him for a long moment. "Crazy? No. Desperate maybe, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes desperate is what it takes to change course." They spread Raymond's topographic maps across the table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs. Neil pointed to various locations he'd been considering. "The first riddle. Where we watch stars tell their ancient stories. I think that's the old fire tower. We used to camp there when I was a kid." Martin nodded. "Makes sense. Raymond loved that tower. Used to say it was the closest he could get to the stars without leaving the ground. The fire tower had been decommissioned years ago, the Forest Service deciding it wasn't cost-effective to maintain. But the structure remained, a steel skeleton against the sky, stairs spiraling up to an observation deck that offered 360-degree views of the wilderness. They drove to the trailhead in Martin's truck, making the kind of easy conversation that comes with old friendship. Martin talked about his late wife, Helen, how he still caught himself setting 2 places at the table. Neil shared his confusion about the divorce, about feeling like a stranger in his own life. "Linda says I disappeared on her," Neil said as they began the hike. "Not physically, but emotionally." "Did you?" The question hung between them as they climbed through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. Neil had been expecting sympathy, not interrogation. "I don't know. Maybe. After my father died, after I turned 50, after Iris graduated college and didn't need me anymore, I guess I started feeling like I was just going through the motions. And now," Neil considered this as they gained elevation, "now I feel like I'm looking for something. I just don't know what yet." The fire tower appeared through the trees after an hour of steady climbing, its steel frame weathered but solid. The stairs spiraled upward, each step ringing hollow beneath their boots. At the top, the observation deck opened onto a view that stole breath and thoughts alike. "There," Martin said, pointing northeast. "You can see Raymond's cabin from here." A tiny speck in the vast green tapestry below, barely visible except for the metal roof catching sunlight. Neil remembered standing here as a boy, Raymond teaching him to use the compass, showing him how to triangulate their position using visible landmarks. "So, where would he hide something up here?" Martin asked. They searched methodically under the weather station equipment, around the support beams, in corners where wind and rain might not reach. It was Martin who found the loose floorboard near the eastern railing. "Help me with this," he said. working his fingers under the edge. The board came up to reveal a weatherproof container tucked into the framework below. Not another stone, but something equally precious. An old logbook, pages yellowed but intact, filled with Raymond's meticulous handwriting. Neil opened it carefully. The entries dated back to the late 70s and early 80s, documenting Raymond's regular visits to the tower. But these weren't technical observations about weather or wildlife. These were personal reflections, thoughts about life and loss, and the particular solitude that comes with high places. July 10, 1979. Neil read aloud. Brought Neil up today. 13 years old and full of questions about everything. Asked me why stars die. Told him they don't die, they transform. He's not satisfied with easy answers, which gives me hope. Martin leaned against the railing, listening as Neil continued reading. The 18th of July, 1980. Last night with Neil before he goes home. We buried the stone today. He doesn't understand yet, but someday he will. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, through time and pressure, changing us from the inside. The entries revealed a side of Raymond that Neil had never fully seen, a man wrestling with his own questions, his own transformations. There were references to loneliness, to choices made and unmade, to the weight of guiding a young boy when he wasn't sure of his own direction. The 15th of August, 1980. Claire left today, drove away without looking back. I stood here watching her car disappear around the bend and knew I'd made the worst mistake of my life. Some roads, once you don't take them, stay closed forever. Neil stopped reading. Claire. He mentioned her in the riddle where we spoke of roads not taken. Martin was quiet for a moment. There's something I should probably tell you about Claire. You knew her, knew of her. Your uncle talked about her once, years ago, late at night, after he'd had a few drinks. Said she was the woman who got away. Neil turned the page, looking for more entries about Claire, but the writing shifted to other subjects, weather patterns, wildlife observations, the slow changes that decades bring to familiar landscapes. At the very end, coordinates were scrawled in the margin: 47.2619 degrees N, 113.985, 4 degrees W. What do you think those coordinates are? Neil asked. Martin pulled out his phone, searched for a mapping app. Looks like they point to a spot about 20 miles north of here, near Glacier Lake. The second riddle, where water meets sky. A high mountain lake where the reflection of clouds made it impossible to tell where the earth ended and heaven began. They climbed back down the tower, the logbook tucked safely in Neil's pack. The artifact from this location wasn't another stone, but something more valuable: insight into Raymond's inner life. Proof that the man Neil had admired for his certainty had struggled with doubt and regret, just like anyone else. Your uncle was leaving you breadcrumbs, Martin said as they hiked back toward the truck. Not just to find these hiding places, but to find yourself. Neil felt the truth of that settling into his bones. This wasn't really about solving riddles or collecting artifacts. It was about understanding Raymond, himself, the connections that make life meaningful. Will you come with me to the lake? Neil asked. To find the second stone? Martin smiled. Wouldn't miss it. But Neil, when we find whatever's waiting there, you need to start thinking about that third riddle, where I said goodbye, where you'll understand. That one's going to be the hardest. The truck descended toward the valley as afternoon clouds gathered over the peaks. Neil held the logbook carefully, these preserved thoughts of a man who'd been trying to teach him something important, something about transformation, about having the courage to crack open and let light in, something he was finally ready to learn. The drive to Glacier Lake took them through country that seemed to exist outside of time. Gravel roads wound between peaks that scraped the belly of low-hanging clouds, past meadows where wildflowers painted the landscape in impossible colors. Neil had forgotten how beautiful this part of the world could be when you slowed down enough to see it. Martin's truck handled the rough road with the confidence of a vehicle that had seen worse. They talked sporadically, comfortable with silence, both men lost in their own thoughts about what they might find at the coordinates Raymond had left behind. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd made different choices?" Neil asked as they climbed toward the lake. Martin glanced at him. "You thinking about Claire? Thinking about everything? Linda, Iris, the way I seem to pull back just when things matter most. Your uncle pulled back too, apparently. From Claire, anyway." The road ended at a small parking area carved from the mountainside. From there, it was a 2-mile hike to the lake, following a trail that switchbacked through alpine forests and across granite slabs carved smooth by ancient glaciers. Neil's legs felt stronger today, more sure of themselves on the uneven terrain. Martin moved beside him with the steady rhythm of someone who'd spent his life in mountains, breathing easy despite the elevation. "Martin," Neil said as they paused to drink water, "can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot. Do you ever regret not having kids? You and Helen?" Martin was quiet for so long that Neil thought he might not answer. Then, "We tried for years. Just wasn't meant to be, I guess. But I figure I got to help raise a generation of young rangers instead. Different kind of legacy." The trail crested a ridge, and suddenly Glacier Lake spread before them, a perfect mirror, reflecting sky and peaks, so still it was impossible to tell where reality ended and reflection began. The coordinates led them to the far shore, where a creek fed into the lake with the gentle sound of water over stones. They searched for an hour before Neil spotted the cairn. 5 flat stones, stacked with the kind of precision that spoke of human intention rather than natural accident. Beneath the bottom stone, wrapped in the same weatherproof material as the note, was a flat piece of shale about the size of a dinner plate. "It's beautiful," Martin said, studying the fossil leaf impression pressed into the stone. "Millions of years old, probably. Look at the detail, you can see every vein." Neil traced the delicate pattern with his finger. The leaf was perfect in its preservation, every detail captured in stone, as clearly as if it had fallen yesterday instead of countless millennia ago. Something so fragile, made eternal by the right conditions. His phone buzzed. Iris calling. Neil stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." "Dad? I was just thinking about you. Mom mentioned you were at Uncle Raymond's place." The sound of her voice hit him harder than expected, familiar, cautious, trying for normal but missing by just enough to reveal the distance between them. "I am. Actually, I found something interesting, something Uncle Raymond left for me." "Oh? What kind of something?" Neil looked at the fossil in his hands, at Martin watching the lake, at the vast wilderness spreading in all directions. How could he explain this without sounding like he'd lost his mind? "It's complicated. A sort of treasure hunt he set up before he died. I'm trying to solve some riddles he left behind." Iris laughed, but not unkindly. "That sounds like Uncle Raymond. He always had that mysterious side. I remember him showing me rocks when I was little, telling me stories about how they formed. I never understood half of what he was talking about, but I loved listening to his voice." "I never knew you remembered that. There's a lot you don't know about me, Dad." The words carried weight, not accusation exactly, but acknowledgement of the gulf that had opened between them over the years. When had he stopped really listening to her? When had their conversations become just surface pleasantries? "You're right," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry for that." A long pause. "Are you okay up there? You sound different." Different. That was what Martin had said too. Maybe cracking open that stone had cracked something open in him as well. "I'm figuring some things out. About Uncle Raymond, about myself, about choices I made, without really understanding why I made them. Dad, I know I haven't been the father you deserved, Iris. Not emotionally. I did what my father did to me, and his father probably did to him. Just went through the motions without really being present." He heard her breathing on the other end of the line, could picture her face, the way she looked when she was trying to decide whether to trust someone with something important. "I've been thinking about that too," she said finally. "About family patterns. About why I seem to pick men who disappear on me emotionally, just like—" She stopped. "Just like I disappeared on you." "Yeah." Neil sat on a boulder beside the lake, the fossil cradled in his lap. Martin had moved away, giving him privacy, pretending to study something interesting in the reeds. "What if I told you I was trying to learn how to do things differently?" Neil asked. "I'd say it's about time." They talked for 20 minutes, really talked, maybe for the first time in years. Iris told him about her job stress, about the relationship that had ended badly, about feeling like she was drifting without direction. Neil told her about the divorce, about his own sense of being lost, about Raymond's unexpected gift of guidance from beyond the grave. "I'd like to see these artifacts sometime," Iris said. "If you wouldn't mind showing them to me. Would you come up to the cabin? Maybe next weekend? I think I'd like that." After she hung up, Neil sat quietly beside the lake. The fossil felt warm in his hands, this ancient thing that had waited eons to be discovered. Just like the conversations he should have had with his daughter years ago. "Good call?" Martin asked, returning from his tactful distance. "Maybe the beginning of one." They photographed the fossil and the location, then began the hike back to the truck. Neil carried the shale carefully, another piece of Raymond's puzzle, another lesson about patience and preservation. "2 down, 1 to go," Martin said as they reached the parking area. The third riddle seemed harder now, more personal. "Where I said goodbye, where you'll understand." "Any ideas?" Neil asked. Martin was quiet for a moment. "There's something I should probably tell you about your uncle's last few months, something that might help with that riddle." Neil waited. He knew he was dying, Neil. Heart was failing, and he refused treatment. Said he'd lived long enough, seen enough, made enough mistakes. But he spent those last months getting his affairs in order, real careful about it. "You think he planned all this? The riddles, the artifacts?" "I think your uncle was a lot more intentional about things than most people gave him credit for." As they drove back toward Raymond's cabin, Neil wondered what his uncle had been trying to prepare him for. What final understanding waited at the end of this strange journey? The fossil sat wrapped in his jacket, ancient proof that beautiful things could survive impossible spans of time if they were held in the right conditions. Maybe some relationships were like that too. Neil spent the rest of the week alone at the cabin, studying Raymond's artifacts and trying to decode the final riddle. "Where I said goodbye, where you'll understand." The words circled in his mind like water finding its level, always returning to the same troubling question. When had Raymond said goodbye? The morning Iris was set to arrive, Neil made coffee and sat on the porch watching mist rise from the valley. 3 days of thinking had brought him no closer to solving the riddle, but something else had shifted. The mountain's silence no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like space room to think, to breathe, to become whatever he was meant to become. Iris's car appeared on the mountain road just after 10, her little Honda taking the curves carefully. Neil felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name, nervousness, hope, fear of disappointment. When had it become so hard to be natural with his own daughter? She stepped out of the car looking older than he remembered, more sure of herself. 32 years old, and he could still see traces of the girl who used to bring him drawings from school, who used to fall asleep against his shoulder during long car rides. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. How was the drive?" "Good. Peaceful. I'd forgotten how beautiful it is up here." She followed him into the cabin, and he watched her take in the space Raymond's sparse furniture, the topographic maps still spread on the table, the artifacts arranged like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. "These are incredible," she said, approaching the split geode. The crystals caught morning light, throwing tiny rainbows across her face. "This is what you found in the buried stone?" Neil told her the whole story again, watching her face as she absorbed the details. She picked up each artifact carefully, the fossil, the logbook, Raymond's original notes, studying them with the kind of attention she'd inherited from him. He realized the ability to focus completely on something that mattered. "So, there's one more riddle to solve," she said, reading Raymond's note. "Where I said goodbye, where you'll understand. Any ideas? I've been thinking about it all week. The problem is, Raymond never really said goodbye to me, not in any formal way. He was just gone one morning, heart attack in his sleep." Iris sat at the kitchen table, still holding the note. "Maybe it's not about saying goodbye to you." "Like who?" "Like Claire." The name hung in the air between them. Neil had told Iris about the painting, about the woman Raymond had loved and lost, but something in his daughter's tone suggested she was thinking about it differently than he had. "You think he said goodbye to Claire somewhere specific?" "I think people don't usually just disappear from each other's lives without some kind of closure, even if it takes 40 years to find the courage for it." Neil studied his daughter's face, seeing intelligence there he'd somehow missed or taken for granted. When had she become so perceptive about human nature? They hiked together to Mirror Lake, following the coordinates from the second riddle. The trail was longer than the one to Glacier Lake, winding through alpine meadows where late wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the approaching autumn. Iris moved beside him with easy confidence, her breathing steady at elevation. "I've been thinking about what you said on the phone," she said as they climbed, "about family patterns, about emotional distance. And I think you're right, about the patterns, I mean, but I also think you're being harder on yourself than you need to be." Neil glanced at her, surprised. "How so?" "You were present, Dad. Maybe not emotionally open the way Mum needed, but you were there. You came to my school plays, helped with homework, taught me to drive. A lot of kids don't get that much. But it wasn't enough. No, it wasn't. But it was something. And maybe learning to do better doesn't mean throwing away everything you did before." Mirror Lake appeared through the trees exactly as Neil remembered, a perfect reflection of sky and peaks, so still it seemed like looking through a window into another world. The painting Claire had made 45 years ago could have been painted this morning. They searched the shoreline methodically, following the pattern Neil had learned from the previous locations. Iris found the marker a flat stone positioned differently from the others, deliberately placed to catch attention. Beneath it, they discovered a metal box wrapped in weatherproof material. Inside, carefully protected, was the painting itself, Claire's watercolor of Mirror Lake at sunset, signed CW 1979 in the lower corner. "Oh my God," Iris breathed. "It's beautiful." The painting was more vivid than Neil had expected, the colors still bright, despite decades of storage. Claire had captured not just the visual beauty of the place, but something deeper, the sense of peace that came with high places, the feeling of being suspended between earth and sky. Behind the painting, tucked into the frame, was another note from Raymond. This one was different, more personal, written with obvious emotion. "Claire painted this the summer I let her go," Neil read aloud. "I chose duty over love, fear over courage. Don't make my mistakes, Neil. When you find someone who sees you, hold on." Iris was quiet for a long moment, studying the painting. "He really loved her." "Sounds like it." "Dad, can I ask you something?" Neil nodded. "Did you love Mum? Really love her, I mean. Not just the idea of being married to her." The question hit harder than he'd expected. "I thought I did. For a long time I was sure I did. But toward the end, I think maybe I loved the life we'd built more than I loved her. Does that make sense?" "It makes sense. And it makes what happened with the divorce make sense too." They sat by the lake as the afternoon sun moved across the sky, exactly matching the light in Claire's painting. Neil felt something loosening in his chest, some knot of guilt and confusion that had been tightening for years. "So where do you think Raymond said goodbye to Claire?" Iris asked. Neil studied the painting, thinking about love and loss and roads not taken. I don't know, but I have an idea who might. That evening, back at the cabin, Neil made a decision that would have been impossible a week ago. He picked up his phone and called information. What city? The operator asked. I'm not sure. Somewhere in Montana. I'm looking for a Claire Westmont, or possibly someone with the initials C.W. It was a long shot, probably futile. People moved, married, changed names. 45 years was a lifetime. But sometimes, Neil was learning, the things you thought were lost forever were just waiting for the right moment to be found again. I have a listing for C. Brennan in Kalispell, the operator said. Would that be helpful? Neil's hand tightened on the phone. Yes, that would be very helpful. Some goodbyes, he thought as he wrote down the number. Take a lifetime to find. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered, her voice cautious but clear. Hello? Neil's mouth went dry. Hello, I'm looking for Claire Brennan, or possibly Claire Westmont. A long pause. Who's asking? My name is Neil Briar. Raymond Briar was my uncle. I found something that belonged to you, or at least something you should know about. The silence stretched so long Neil wondered if the line had gone dead. Then, Raymond's nephew. I wondered if anyone in his family would ever reach out. You knew about me. He talked about you. In his letters. Letters. Another pause, then a soft laugh. Oh dear, you don't know, do you? We never lost touch, Raymond and I. Not completely. He wrote to me every Christmas for 40 years. Neil felt the world tilt slightly. Iris looked up from where she was studying the painting, sensing something in his voice. Every Christmas. Would you like to meet? I think we have things to discuss that shouldn't be done over the phone. An hour later, Neil and Iris sat in the living room of a modest house in Kalispell, drinking tea from delicate china cups and trying to reconcile the woman before them with the story they thought they knew. Claire Brennan was 73 years old, silver-haired and elegant, with the kind of presence that comes from someone who has made peace with both joy and sorrow. But it was her eyes that stopped Neil cold, the same thoughtful gaze he'd seen in Raymond's face countless times. You look like him, she said, studying Neil's features. Around the eyes, especially. Mrs. Brennan. Claire, please, and this must be Iris. Raymond wrote about you too, dear, said you were studying to be a teacher. Iris shook her head. That was years ago. I work in marketing now. Ah. Well, plans change. Raymond understood that better than most. Claire moved to an old secretary desk in the corner and pulled out a wooden box. 40 Christmas letters, she said, setting it carefully on the coffee table. I kept every one. Neil stared at the box as if it might contain explosives. I don't understand. If you stayed in touch, why did the note say he let you go? Claire sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. Because he did let me go, just not in the way you think. She opened the box and pulled out the most recent letter, dated December 2023, just months before Raymond died. May I? She asked, then began reading aloud. Dear Claire, this will be my last Christmas letter. The doctors say my heart won't see another winter, and I find myself oddly at peace with that. I've been thinking about that summer at Mirror Lake, about the choice I made to let you go. I told you then it was about duty, about not wanting to abandon my responsibilities. But the truth is, I was afraid. Claire paused, looking at Neil. He was married when we met, separated but not divorced. His wife was well, she had problems, drinking, other men, but she threatened to make things very difficult if he tried to leave. So he stayed. He stayed. And I left. But we never stopped caring about each other. She continued reading from the letter. I let you go because I thought I was protecting you from the mess my life had become. But I realize now I was protecting myself from having to choose between safety and happiness. You deserved better than a man who was too afraid to fight for what he wanted. Iris leaned forward. So why the letters? Why stay in touch if you couldn't be together? Claire smiled sadly. Because love doesn't end just because the timing is wrong. We wrote to each other about books, about the changing seasons, about our separate lives. I told him when I married Walter, when I had children. He told me about you, Neil, about watching you grow up, about how proud he was of the man you were becoming. He had children? Neil asked. I had children. Walter and I had 2 daughters. Raymond never married anyone else, never had a family of his own. I think that was part of his regret. She pulled out another letter, older, the paper more yellowed. This one is from 1995. I drove past Mirror Lake today and thought about the painting you made. I still have it, you know. I hope someday to find the courage to return it to you, but for now it sits on my mantel like a window to the best summer of my life. Neil felt something shift in his understanding. He kept the painting for 40 years, and I kept his letters. Claire gestured to the box, 2 people holding on to pieces of each other across decades. But Mrs. Brennan, Iris said gently, if you cared about each other all this time, why didn't you? Why didn't we find a way to be together? Claire finished. By the time we were both free after Walter died, after Raymond's wife finally left him, we were different people. The love was still there, but we'd built separate lives. Sometimes the window closes, dear, not because the feeling dies, but because the timing never aligns. She pulled out the final letter again, reading the conclusion. I've hidden something for Neil to find, a trail of breadcrumbs that will lead him to the painting, and I hope, to you. Not because I want you to mourn with him, but because I want him to understand that some loves are worth the risk, even when they don't work out the way we planned. Tell him that, for me, Claire, tell him that the courage to love completely is never a mistake, even when it leads to loss. Neil sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. This wasn't just about Raymond's regret. It was about a 40-year conversation between 2 people who had chosen different paths, but never stopped caring about each other. There's something else, Claire said, reaching into the box one more time. The last thing Raymond sent me. It was a small envelope, addressed simply to Neil. Inside, a single sheet of paper with coordinates and a brief message. The final stone isn't buried, Neil. It's waiting where I finally said goodbye. Cemetery, plot 47B. I was never brave enough to say it in person, but I said it to her headstone every year for the last 15 years. Love is always worth the risk. Neil looked up, confused. Her headstone? Claire's eyes filled with tears. Walter died 15 years ago. Every year on the anniversary of the summer we met, Raymond would come to the cemetery and talk to Walter's grave, thanking him for taking care of me, apologizing for the letters, explaining why he could never let me go completely. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock. That's where he said goodbye, Neil said slowly. Not to you, to the guilt, to the what-ifs, and where you'll understand, Iris added softly, what it means to choose love over fear. Claire stood and walked to a bookshelf, returning with the painting Claire's watercolor of Mirror Lake, exactly as Neil remembered, but somehow more vivid in person. This belongs to you now, she said, offering it to Neil. Raymond wanted you to have it, but more than that, he wanted you to understand what it represents. Neil took the painting carefully. What does it represent? The moment when love is perfect, Claire said simply. Before fear or duty or circumstance gets in the way. Raymond and I had one perfect summer. Most people never get that much. As they prepared to leave, Claire walked them to the door. Will you visit the cemetery? She asked. Will you finish what Raymond started? Neil nodded, still holding the painting. We'll go tomorrow. Good. And Neil? Your uncle was right about something else. You do look like a man who's ready to stop being afraid. Standing on Claire's porch in the gathering dusk, Neil realized that everything he'd thought he understood about Raymond's story had been only part of the truth. This wasn't just about buried stones and hidden artifacts. It was about a man teaching his nephew, across the span of death itself, that love, imperfect, complicated, risky love, was always worth choosing. Even when it came too late. Even when it led to loss. Even when it changed everything. The drive to the cemetery the next morning felt like traveling toward an inevitable conclusion. Neil and Iris had spent most of the night talking about Raymond and Claire, about love and loss, about the patterns that repeat themselves across generations until someone finds the courage to break them. "Are you nervous?" Iris asked as they turned into the cemetery gates. "Terrified," Neil admitted, "which probably means I'm doing the right thing." Kalispell Memorial Cemetery stretched across rolling hills dotted with mature trees, their leaves just beginning to turn. It was peaceful in the way that only cemeteries could be, a place where time moved differently, where the urgent concerns of daily life faded into perspective. They found plot 47B without difficulty, a simple granite headstone reading, "Walter James Brennan, 1949 to 2009, beloved husband and father." The grass around it was well maintained, and fresh flowers, white lilies, had been placed there recently. "Claire still comes here," Iris observed. Neil knelt beside the headstone, running his fingers over the coordinates Raymond had left in his final note. According to the directions, the last artifact should be buried here, near where Raymond had spent 15 years working up the courage to say goodbye. But something felt wrong about digging in a cemetery, even with permission from beyond the grave. Neil looked around, studying the other markers, the carefully tended landscape, the few other visitors moving quietly among the graves. "Dad, look at this." Iris was examining a small granite marker about 10 feet away, partially hidden by an overgrown shrub. The inscription was simple: Raymond Briar, 1951 to 2024. He loved deeply. Neil stared at the grave. "I didn't know he was buried here." "The funeral was at the funeral home in town," Iris finished. "But you left before the burial, remember? You said you couldn't handle watching them lower the casket." The memory came back, Neil walking away from the graveside service, overwhelmed by grief and guilt over all the conversations he'd never had with his uncle. He'd thought Raymond was buried in the municipal cemetery across town. "He wanted to be near Walter," Neil said, understanding dawning. "Near Claire's family." They approached Raymond's grave together. The headstone was new, the grass still sparse around the edges. Someone had been here recently. The same white lilies that adorned Walter's grave were placed carefully at the base of Raymond's marker. "Claire," Iris said softly. Neil knelt and examined the ground around the headstone. The earth was soft, recently turned, as if someone had been digging here. Not deep excavation, but careful disturbance of the soil near the marker's base. "There," Iris pointed. "Something's been buried there recently." Neil used his hands to carefully move the soft earth, mindful of the sacred nature of the place. About 6 inches down, his fingers encountered something hard and smooth, not stone this time, but metal. He pulled out a small lockbox, the kind used for important documents. It was new, the metal still bright, with a simple combination lock. Taped to the top was an envelope addressed, "For Neil," in Raymond's familiar handwriting. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of paper with 3 numbers, the combination, and a final message. "My dear nephew, if you're reading this, you've followed my trail to its end and learned the most important lesson I could never teach you directly. Love is always worth the risk, even when it doesn't work out the way we planned. Inside this box is my final gift to you, not another artifact, but a choice." Neil's hands shook as he worked the combination lock. Inside the box, he found a thick journal bound in leather, and beneath that, a small velvet pouch. The journal was filled with Raymond's handwriting, page after page of entries dating back several months. The 15th of January 2024, Neil read aloud. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. Cancer, they think, though at my age, does it matter what kills you? I'm not afraid of dying, but I am afraid of leaving Neil without guidance. He's lost, has been for years, and I don't think he knows how to find his way back to what matters. Iris sat beside her father on the grass, listening as he continued reading. The 3rd of February 2024. I've decided to create a trail for Neil to follow after I'm gone, not just to the artifacts, but to understanding. He needs to learn what I learned too late, that hiding from connection doesn't protect you from pain. It just guarantees that you'll face that pain alone. The entries detailed Raymond's careful planning of the entire treasure hunt, choosing the artifacts, writing the riddles, arranging for the journal to be buried after his death. But more than that, they revealed a man coming to terms with his own mortality and his responsibility to the nephew he'd helped raise. The 20th of March 2024, Claire came to see me today. First time we've been in the same room in 45 years. She looks older, of course, but I could still see the woman who painted Mirror Lake in her eyes. She wanted to know if I regretted the choice I made that summer. I told her no, because regret implies wishing for a different past, and our past led to the love we've shared in letters all these years. But I told her I wished I'd been braver. Neil paused in his reading, overwhelmed by the image of Raymond and Claire meeting after all those years, 2 elderly people finally having the conversation they should have had decades earlier. "What's in the pouch?" Iris asked gently. Neil opened the velvet bag and poured its contents into his palm. A small key, old brass, attached to a tag with an address in downtown Kalispell. The 1st of April 2024, Neil continued reading. I've purchased a small storage unit and filled it with things I want Neil to have, not just my belongings, but letters from Claire, photographs from our summer together, the complete story of a love that lasted 45 years, even though we could only spend 1 season together. The key is my final gift to him and to Claire. Some stories need to be preserved. The final entry was dated the day before Raymond died, the 15th of April 2024. Tomorrow I'll ask Claire to help me bury this journal near Walter's grave. It seems fitting, the place where I learned to stop being afraid of my own heart. If Neil finds this, if he's followed the trail this far, then he's ready for the last truth. The courage to love completely is never a mistake, even when it leads to loss, even when it comes too late, even when it changes everything. Neil closed the journal and looked at his daughter. He orchestrated all of this while he was dying. The stones, the riddles, even his own burial location. He wanted to make sure you found your way to understanding, Iris said. Neil stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked at the 2 graves, Raymond's and Walter's, side by side, connected by 40 years of impossible love, and the woman who had cared for both men in different ways. There's one more thing we need to do, he said, pulling out his phone. What's that? We need to call Claire. This story isn't finished yet. As Neil dialed Claire's number, he felt something shift inside him, not the cracking open he'd experienced with the first stone, but something deeper. The settling of understanding into his bones, the recognition that some truths could only be learned by following them to their end. Raymond's final lesson wasn't about buried artifacts or hidden messages. It was about having the courage to complete what love begins, even when that completion comes decades after the beginning. Even when it requires facing what you've spent a lifetime avoiding. Even when it means opening your heart in a cemetery at age 58, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and love well risked. The phone rang, and Claire's voice answered. Hello? Claire, it's Neil. We found the journal, and we need your help with one last thing. Claire arrived at the cemetery an hour later, carrying a small bouquet of mountain wildflowers and moving with the careful dignity of someone who had made peace with both love and loss. She stood between the 2 graves, her husband's and her first love's, and Neil could see 45 years of complicated emotion playing across her features. "He planned this too," she said softly, studying Raymond's headstone. "Asked me specifically to make sure he was buried here, next to Walter. Said it was time to stop hiding from the truth." Neil handed her Raymond's final journal. "Did you know about all of it? The treasure hunt, the artifacts?" "Some of it. He told me he was leaving you a trail to follow, but I didn't know the details." Claire opened the journal, reading passages she'd clearly seen before. "He showed me some of these entries before he died, asked if I thought he was doing the right thing. And I told him that you can't teach courage. You can only create opportunities for people to discover it in themselves." Iris knelt beside Walter's grave, reading the inscription. "How long were you married?" 37 years. Good years, mostly. Walter knew about Raymond, about the letters. He was a secure man, confident enough to understand that the heart has room for different kinds of love. She placed half the wildflowers on Walter's grave, half on Raymond's. They would have liked each other, I think. Both of them understood that love isn't a competition. Neil pulled out the brass key Raymond had left. "There's a storage unit. Raymond said it contains the complete story." Claire nodded. "He asked me to go there with him 2 weeks before he died, wanted to make sure everything was arranged properly." The storage facility was a 10-minute drive from the cemetery, one of those modern places with climate-controlled units and electronic locks. Unit 247 was small, about the size of a walk-in closet, but carefully organized. Against one wall stood a tall filing cabinet, against another a small table and chair, as if Raymond had spent time here contemplating what he was leaving behind. In the center of the space sat a large wooden chest, the kind used for hope or cedar storage. "He called it his treasure chest," Claire said, unlocking the chest with a second key from her purse. "Said it contained 45 years of proof that love doesn't end just because circumstances change." Inside, Neil found carefully organized stacks of letters, hundreds of them, dating back to 1980. Christmas cards, birthday greetings, postcards from trips, simple notes about daily life, a correspondence that had lasted longer than many marriages. "Dear Claire," Neil read from one at random. "The aspens are turning gold earlier this year. I walked past Mirror Lake yesterday and thought about your painting, how you captured that perfect moment when summer holds its breath before becoming autumn." Iris pulled out another letter, dated just 5 years earlier. "Dear Raymond, I finally tried oil painting again after all these years. Not very good at it anymore, but I painted the lake from memory. Funny how some images never fade." At the bottom of the chest, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, Neil found photographs. Claire and Raymond in 1979, young and radiant, caught in moments of casual intimacy. Her painting at the easel while he watched, him teaching her to use a compass, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "We documented that whole summer," Claire said, her voice thick with memory, "as if we knew it was all we'd have." The filing cabinet contained even more drafts of letters never sent, poems Raymond had written, pressed flowers from hikes they'd taken together, an entire relationship preserved in paper and memory. "This isn't just about you and Raymond," Iris said suddenly, understanding dawning in her voice. "This is about all of us, about the stories we don't tell, the connections we're afraid to make." Neil found a folder labeled "For Neil" and opened it carefully. Inside, a letter in Raymond's handwriting, but different from the others, more formal, more intentional. "My dear nephew," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, you've followed my trail to its end and learned what I couldn't teach you any other way. Love is always worth the risk. Not because it always works out the way we plan, but because the alternative, living without risking connection, isn't really living at all." The letter continued, "I want you to understand something about Claire and Walter and me. We didn't have a love triangle, we had a love story with 3 chapters. Claire and I had our chapter in 1979. She and Walter had theirs for 37 years, and Claire and I had ours in letters and memory. None of those chapters diminished the others. Iris was studying photographs, tears running down her cheeks. "Look at this." Showing Neil a picture of Raymond teaching a young boy, clearly Neil himself, to skip stones on a lake. "I don't remember that being taken," Neil said. "Claire took it," said the voice behind them. "The summer you were 14, Raymond brought you to meet me, said you needed to understand that not all goodbyes are endings." Neil turned to find Claire studying him with those penetrating eyes. "I met you before, once. For about an hour. You were so focused on learning to skip stones properly that you barely noticed the strange woman with the camera." She smiled. "Raymond said you inherited his ability to concentrate completely on what mattered to you." The pieces were falling into place, not just the treasure hunt Raymond had designed, but the larger pattern of his life, the careful way he'd woven love and loss and memory into something that could survive his death. "There's one more thing," Claire said, reaching into her purse. "Something Raymond asked me to give you, but only after you'd found everything else." She handed Neil a small, wrapped package. Inside, a compass, not Raymond's brass surveying compass, but a new one, modern, with an inscription on the back: "True North isn't a place, it's a choice. R. B. to Nota Bene, 2024. "He wanted you to understand," Claire said, "that the compass doesn't just point north, it points toward what matters most. And what matters most is always love, the courage to risk it, to honor it, to let it guide you, even when you can't see where you're going." Neil held the compass, watching its needle find magnetic north with the same unwavering certainty Raymond had always possessed about the important things in life. "So what happens now?" Iris asked. Neil looked around the storage unit at 45 years of love preserved in letters and photographs, at evidence that connection could survive any circumstance if people cared enough to maintain it. "Now," he said, "we finish what Uncle Raymond started. We stop being afraid of what love might cost us and start paying attention to what it might give us." He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Linda's number, his ex-wife, who deserved an apology, his daughter, who deserved a father willing to risk being emotionally present, himself, who deserved the chance to love completely before it was too late. "Now we choose courage over safety," he said, and pressed call. Linda answered on the third ring, her voice cautious but familiar. "Neil, is everything okay?" Standing in Raymond's storage unit, surrounded by 45 years of preserved love, Neil felt the words he'd been rehearsing disappear. Instead, he found himself saying simply, "I wanted to apologize." A long pause. "For what?" "For disappearing on you, for being present in body but absent everywhere else, for making you carry the weight of our marriage alone for the last 10 years. Claire and Iris had stepped outside, giving him privacy, but he could see them through the window, two women from different generations, connected now by Raymond's story and the understanding that love comes in many forms. "Neil," Linda began, "I know it's too late to save our marriage. I know you've moved on, and that's good. You deserved better than what I gave you. But I needed you to know that I understand now. What I did wrong, why you felt so alone. What happened up there? You sound different." Neil looked around the storage unit at the evidence of a love that had survived impossible circumstances. "I found something Uncle Raymond left for me. A lesson about courage, about not letting fear make your choices for you. The uncle who died. I thought you barely knew him. Turns out I barely knew anything. About him, about myself, about what really matters." They talked for 20 minutes, the longest honest conversation they'd had in years. Linda told him about her new relationship, about feeling guilty for being happy. Neil told her about the artifacts, about learning that love doesn't diminish by being shared, that honoring the past doesn't require staying trapped in it. "I want you to be happy, Linda. You deserve that. I want that for you too, Neil. You're a good man. You just forgot how to show it." "I know. I'm trying to learn again." When he hung up, Neil felt something lifting from his chest, not the pain of loss, but the weight of guilt he'd been carrying. Claire and Iris came back inside, their faces carefully neutral. "How did that go?" Iris asked. "Better than I expected. Like Raymond said, some conversations are worth having, even when they come too late to change anything." Claire was studying a photograph of herself and Raymond from 1979, both of them young and radiant in the mountain sunlight. He was right about something else, too. Love doesn't end just because the form changes. Neil pulled out his phone again, this time calling Martin. "Neil, you find what you were looking for? More than I was looking for. Martin, would you be willing to come to dinner this weekend? At the cabin? I want to tell you the whole story." "Course. You cooking?" "Iris is coming too. We'll figure something out." After he hung up, Neil realized what was happening. He was rebuilding connections, one conversation at a time, not trying to recapture the past, but creating something new from what remained. "Dad," Iris said quietly, "I have something to tell you too." Neil looked at his daughter, seeing something in her face he hadn't noticed before, determination mixed with vulnerability. "I've been thinking about what you said, about family patterns, about emotional distance. I think I've been doing the same thing you did." "How so?" "With Jake, my ex-boyfriend. I pulled away when things got serious, convinced myself I was protecting us both from eventual disappointment, just like you did with Mom." Neil felt recognition hit him like a physical blow. "You were protecting yourself, just like you were. Just like Uncle Raymond did with Claire, at least at first." They stood together in the storage unit, 3 generations of love stories surrounding them. Raymond and Claire's impossible correspondence, Neil's marriage that died from emotional starvation, Iris's relationship that ended from self-imposed distance. "So what do we do differently?" Iris asked. Claire looked up from the photographs. "You choose courage over safety. Every day, in small ways and large ones, you show up for each other, especially when it's uncomfortable." Neil thought about Jake, the man his daughter had described as kind, patient, willing to wait for her to be ready for real intimacy. "Do you love him?" he asked. "I think I do. I think I have for a while. But I was terrified of what that might mean. Then maybe it's time to find out." Neil helped Claire carefully repack the chest, preserving 45 years of love letters for whatever came next. The storage unit would remain a shrine to the idea that love could survive any circumstance if people cared enough to tend it. "What will you do with all this?" he asked Claire. "Keep it safe. Maybe donate it someday to the Historical Society. Let other people see what's possible when you don't let fear make your choices." As they prepared to leave the storage facility, Claire handed Neil one final item, a small envelope addressed to the next generation. "Raymond wrote this for Iris," she said. "Asked me to give it to her when she was ready to understand." Iris opened the letter carefully, reading silently, her eyes filled with tears. "What does it say?" Neil asked. "It says I'm braver than I know, that the courage to love completely runs in the family, even if it sometimes skips a generation, and that Uncle Raymond hopes I won't wait 45 years to learn what he's trying to teach." The 3 of them stood in the parking lot of a storage facility in Kalispell, Montana, holding pieces of a love story that had lasted nearly half a century. Around them, ordinary life continued, cars passing, people running errands, the mundane business of a Tuesday afternoon. But for Neil, everything had changed. He understood now what Raymond had been trying to teach him through artifacts and riddles and the careful orchestration of discovery. Love wasn't something you protected by hiding it away. It was something you honored by risking it, by showing up completely, by choosing connection over safety again and again until it became as natural as breathing. "Thank you," he said to Claire, "for preserving all of this, for helping me understand. Thank you for following his trail to the end. Raymond would be pleased." As they prepared to drive away, Neil pulled out the new compass Raymond had left him. The needle swung confidently toward magnetic north, But for the first time in years, Neil knew exactly where he was going. Home to the mountain cabin, where he would call his daughter every week, where he would invite Martin for regular dinners, where he would begin the slow work of learning to live with his heart open, even though that meant accepting the possibility of loss. Because Raymond had been right about the most important thing. The courage to love completely was never a mistake, even when it came too late, even when it changed everything, especially then. 3 months later, Neil stood on the ridge where it all began. But he wasn't alone this time. Iris had driven up for the weekend, and Martin had joined them for what had become a monthly tradition, hiking to the place where Raymond had buried the first stone, where Neil had learned that some things take decades to crack open and reveal their beauty. "Right here," Neil said, pointing to the spot where he dug with his bare hands, following a 45-year-old memory. The earth had healed itself, grass growing over the disturbance, but Neil could still feel the significance of the place. "It's beautiful up here," Iris said, setting down a small pack she'd been carrying. "I can see why Uncle Raymond chose this spot." "What's in the bag?" Martin asked. Iris smiled, the expression that had become more frequent over the past months, as she worked up the courage to call Jake, to apologize for her fear, to ask if he was willing to start over with honesty instead of self-protection. They were taking it slow, but they were taking it together. "Something Dad and I found last week," she said, pulling out a perfect geode about the size of a grapefruit, completely intact, just waiting to be opened. Neil had discovered it while hiking alone, exploring the country around Raymond's cabin with new eyes. The geode had been sitting in plain sight beside a creek, as if it had been waiting for him to be ready to see it. "Are you going to crack it open?" Martin asked. "Eventually," Neil said. "But not yet. I thought we might bury it instead, start our own tradition." They found the perfect spot, not far from where Raymond's stone had waited for 45 years. As they dug together, Neil thought about the changes that 3 months had brought. Weekly phone calls with Iris that had evolved from awkward to easy to essential. Dinner with Martin every Sunday, filling the mountain silence with conversation and laughter. Even a tentative friendship developing with Linda, who had started sending him photographs of places she traveled with her new partner, not to hurt him, but to share beauty, the way people do when they've forgiven each other. "Before we bury this," Iris said, "I want to write something to go with it." She pulled out a small notebook and began writing. When she finished, she showed them the note. "To whoever finds this, whenever that might be, this geode was buried by Neil Briar and his daughter Iris in October 2024, in memory of Raymond Briar, who taught us that beautiful things grow in empty spaces when you give them enough time and pressure. Don't rush the process. Don't fear the cracking open. And remember, true north isn't a place you find, it's a choice you make every day to move toward what matters most." They sealed the note in a waterproof container with the geode and lowered it carefully into the hole. Martin helped pack the earth around it, and Neil used stones from the ridge to build a small cairn, not obvious enough to draw attention, but distinctive enough that he would remember the spot. "Think anyone will find it?" Martin asked. "Someday," Neil said, "when they're ready for what it has to teach them." They hiked back to the cabin as afternoon sun slanted through the trees. The artifacts from Raymond's treasure hunt were displayed on a shelf. Neil had built the split geode with its amethyst crystals, the fossilized leaf, the logbook from the fire tower, Claire's painting of Mirror Lake. Not a museum, exactly, but a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. "Claire called yesterday," Neil said as they prepared dinner together. "She wanted to know if we'd like to come to Thanksgiving dinner." "At her house?" Iris asked. "At her house. She said it's time to stop treating the past like something to be ashamed of and start treating it like something to be grateful for. Are you going to go?" Neil considered the question. A few months ago, the idea would have terrified him, sitting around a table with Claire, meeting her family, navigating the complexity of a relationship that existed outside normal categories. But Raymond's compass sat on the mantel, its needle pointing steadily north, reminding him that courage was a choice you made one decision at a time. "I think we are, yes, if you want to. I'd like that. Jake could come too, if Claire doesn't mind. I'm sure she'd love to meet him." That evening, they sat on the cabin porch watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The valley spread below them, vast and peaceful, holding secrets and stories and the promise of seasons yet to come. "Do you ever miss it?" Iris asked. "Your old life? Before you found the stone?" Neil thought about the man he'd been 3 months ago, isolated, going through the motions, convinced that emotional distance was the same thing as emotional safety. That man felt like a stranger now, someone he'd known but never really understood. "I miss the simplicity of it sometimes," he said honestly. "It was easier when I didn't have to think about connection, about showing up for people. But it wasn't really living." Raymond was right. The courage to love completely is worth the risk, even when it leads to loss. Martin raised his coffee mug in a toast. "To Raymond Briar, who knew how to leave a trail worth following." "To Uncle Raymond," Iris agreed. "To second chances," Neil added, thinking of all the relationships he was rebuilding, all the connections he was finally brave enough to tend. They sat in comfortable silence as stars appeared overhead, the same constellations Raymond had shown him decades ago, still wheeling through space with ancient patience. Neil pulled out the compass Raymond had left him, watching its needle find true north in the gathering darkness. Some things, he reflected, took decades to crack open and reveal their beauty. Some men did too. But when they finally found the courage to let light in, the view was worth the wait. The mountain silence held them gently, full of peace and possibility, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from finally understanding what matters most. True north, Neil had learned, wasn't a destination. It was a daily choice to move toward love instead of fear, toward connection instead of isolation, toward the people who saw you clearly and chose to stay anyway. The compass needle held steady, pointing the way home.